I'm the Godless Engineer, and I analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be looking at an interview from Cameron over at Capturing Christianity. Let's see what he's talking about.
In today's live stream, we're going to take a close look at evidence for the Bible that's taken a lot of us, including apologists and philosophers, by surprise. It's actually been around a little while, but it's taken the work of some really brilliant philosophers to bring this to light, bring it back to light. The technical name for this kind of evidence, is undesigned coincidences.
Wait, I've heard this before.
So number one, the hypothesis of historicism, that is the idea that Jesus did in fact exist, best explains what are called unexplained allusions in the accounts concerning Jesus. We'll talk about what those are shortly. Secondly, the hypothesis of historicism best explains undesigned coincidences in the accounts concerning Jesus. Thirdly, the hypothesis of historicism best explains Paul's understanding that Jesus was an historical figure.
Oh yeah, this is that bullshit argument that McClatchy brought up in my debate with him, because he thinks that the Gospels were written closer to the time of Paul, which we have no evidence for. He also uses this particular argument to say that the Gospels were written independently of each other, which we definitely have evidence against. Phew. I can't wait to see what Cameron has for us today. So the argument from Undesigned Coincidences has been around for a long time, and it's just as hogwash now as it was over 100 years ago. You may not have heard about this argument until recently because it was originally formed by Reverend J.J. Blunt back in 1853. But even Blunt got his argument from an apologist in the previous century. So basically, this argument dates back to the 18th century. You see, by the time that the argument was originally formed by Blunt, we were already recognizing that the Gospels were actually based off of each other. You see, the Gospel authors read these other Gospels and then changed, redacted, and added to these previous Gospels in order to form their own narrative, their own message. The examples and explanations that Cameron's guest, Lydia McGrew, gives in this particular interview show exactly opposite of what she's trying to accomplish. And Cameron, right out the gate, lays out what this argument is actually supposed to prove.
The basic idea is that there are these sort of unintended connections between the Gospels, between the Gospel accounts, that tell us that basically real people were writing this based on their experiences.
Lydia McGrew is the most recent proponent of these undesigned coincidences. And like Cameron laid out in that previous section, it's meant to prove the independence and reliability of the gospel narratives. Now, in this next section, Cameron is going to lay out how this argument exactly works to prove that the Gospels were written by the people that they are attributed to, that they are independent, and most importantly, that they are eyewitnesses to these events.
J. Warner Wallace talks about this a lot in his work, is how between two witnesses, if there are different details that sort of overlap, then that lends veracity or lends credibility to each of their testimonies that they give. If there are details that sort of overlap in a way that doesn't really seem like they were trying to plan it.
Right.
And that's where it's actually important that the two words that go back to back here, undesigned coincidences, both of them are really, really important.
You know, I seriously question J. Warner Wallace's detective skills. And every time I hear one of his arguments, I think that exact same thing. In this instance, both Cameron and J. Warner Wallace are using a false equivocation in order to make their harebrained apologetics seem rational. The false equivocation here comes in with the fact that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. In the case of actual eyewitness accounts, the logic would be sound. You see, Mark definitely read Paul in order to inform his gospel, and he also got the basic skeletal structure for Jesus' story from the life of Jesus ben Ananias, who was recorded by Josephus. Then Matthew read Mark and made some additions and redactions and extrapolations on different things to make his gospel different. Luke comes along and he does the exact same thing with both Matthew and Mark. And then John did the same thing with those three other guys. Oh, and to top it all off, these were written 10 or more years apart from one another and 40 years, at least 40 years after Jesus supposedly died. This is synonymous with one guy hallucinating an event. And then completely different people, unrelated to the entire situation, come in, hear this guy's hallucination story, and then make changes and redactions, and they copy off of each other's papers, and they come away with similar but different accounts. And then they claim to be eyewitnesses to an event that just never happened. Do you understand why I don't consider this argument to be good at all?
So let's talk about the phrase itself. Like, why do we need undesigned, and then why do we need coincidences for this phrase to really make sense and do all this work?
So it's useful to note that the word coincidence there is originally an older use of that term. So this term was coined by William Paley in the late 1700s. So that's going back a little bit. And so when he said coincidence, he meant something like coincidence. So coming together, connection. Not coincidence in the sense like, oh, it just happened that way. It's totally chance. In fact, the whole point is that it's not chance, that it's because these actually are both based on reality.
This totally ignores the fact that the Gospels were written years apart, and the Gospel authors definitely read the previous Gospels in order to craft their stories. You're presupposing that they are early and independent documents in order to prove that they are early and independent. How does this not sound circular to you? Also, I'm very glad that you understand that this argument dates all the way back to the 18th century. It's really sad to see Cameron presenting this argument as like a good position to hold. If this is the intellectual side of Christianity, we got nothing to worry about.